dreadlock rasta. It was a buffalo soldier in the heart of America, stolen from Africa, brought to America.
Thank you for tuning in to Tackling the Taboo, a journey of self-discovery through Black love. Under my voice, you hear Buffalo Soldier by Bob Marley and the Wailers off the album Legend, the best of Bob Marley and the Wailers. This episode is part one of a journey into history. We'll be delving into the ways in which history is constructed and what it means to connect one's individual self to a broader collective history. In this episode, you will hear DJ Dupsie, and with me,
DJ StyloMac.
And we're just gonna kind of give our thoughts and musings, about history and specifically the intersection of Black history and all the layers within that. And so first we're going to start off with a quote, and I'll let DJ
StyloMac
take it from here.
Alright, so the quote is by Haitian historian Michel Rolfe Trouillot, and I believe it's from his book Silencing the Past. So if the quote speaks to y'all, definitely pick it up when you can. But let's get to it. So but the past does not exist independently from the present. Indeed, the past is only past because there is a present. Just as I can point to something over there only because I am here, but nothing is inherently over there or here. In that sense, the past has no content. The past, or more accurately, pastness, is a position. Thus, in no way can we identify the past as past. When you look at how history is also constructed, you can kind of come to see that very, very abstract ways of viewing the world, very different ways of viewing the world are othered and said to be incorrect, said to be, again, quote-unquote, backwards, quote-unquote, savage. The ways in which the indigeneity of the Americas viewed the land, the different deities that they worship, the different smaller pre-colonial African nations who themselves were not, they did not consider themselves African. They considered themselves Igbo, Nzade, Asante, these different nations and small communities, and the ways in which they viewed the world. When you look at how they viewed the world, that's a piece of geographical knowledge. It's not just them sitting down, writing a paper here and there, explaining how they view it. They understood it very much more spiritually, in that everything they knew was a production of their relationships to the land, to the wildlife, to themselves, to surrounding nations, communities, and kingdoms. And all that was kind of scrapped. It's all a process. I'm not saying that one day some white man woke up and said, we're going to do this. It was all a process in which specific points in time changed. Something had to change in order for when Prince Henry came to the western coast of the motherland, and the first enslaved Africans were bought and sold. Something had to happen in order for that buying and selling to continue and expand into the Atlantic slave trade, and eventually that racialization of Black folks, which was not explicit racialization, it was more a generalization of folks in the continent of Africa as being backwards, and then it turned into racialization of them being Black. And even then, on the Barracoons, this identity within the Barracoons, this identity between those enslaved Africans, it was very it was subconscious. It was not explicit nor conscious. It was more of they began to pick up different signals as to why we're down here when they're down there, why we are in shackles, why we are being bought and sold. And it was no longer that I'm Igbo and you are Yoruba, so we can't interact. It was more like we're here in the same situation, and we're in this position where our now community members are being subjugated, especially if they come from your community that was wiped out or subjugated and then put into these different barracoons, and members of your community that you see being subjected to physical and sexual violence as well as assault, torture, inhumane conditions. They're not victimized. They're survivors. They adapt into, now they need to unify themselves, and there's a lot of unity. And there's always the narratives of plantation hierarchies and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, there was for sure this division in these hierarchies, especially along lines of colorism. But at the end of the day, even most of enslaved folks weren't even in large plantations. They were more in smaller homes or inside the home. But in these different points of geography, these different landscapes, whether it was a plantation, whether it was a smaller home, what have you, even in free black communities in the Americas, different forms of geographical knowledge were produced, but similarly in the ways in which their different landscapes themselves racialized black folks and the different signifiers that racialize blackness and kind of has some type of otherness. So I hope this kind of made sense, but the ways in which how they understood their position was both similar and different to how folks in folks in what we now know to be Haiti, how they understood their position, and to the different processes of racialization, and the ways which they understood their position prior to the revolution was similar and different to the folks in, let's say, Alabama, and what we now know to be Alabama, and the different plantations that were there and how they came to understand their position. Because blackness itself was racialized along fixed and flexible lines, given, again, the different landscape. Because in the DR, in the Dominican Republic, as we know it now, that was not per se a plantation society in most regions, because it was more rugged. It was more for cattle ranching. So the different ways in which the enslavers and the enslaved had to interact was very different, because what required of cattle ranching was for everybody to be on a horse. Whereas when you go to the Americas, you would never see an enslaved or free black person on a horse. But the ways in which that had to be it had to convey some sort of signifier that it was okay for them to be on the horse, while also pointing that they were somehow, some way still, quote unquote, inferior to these Spanish, and then at one point French, but then again Spanish and slave owners. So I hope that kind of made sense. It was a little bit abstract, but I'm gonna hand it back to you.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of good points there, and probably a lot of facts for any history buffs out there for to go and research. There's certainly a lot of nuggets in there for folks to go back and check into. One thing that stuck out to me, because I'll admit I'm not as versed on dates or names or figures and stuff like that, but just the idea of how time and history is constructed, right, and how that intersects with the racial construction, right, and I think of the story part of history. I think for me is more so that piece of it, the stories within the stories, the meta narratives, right? And so one big story that you touched on was the events that led up to the slave trade, right, in the Americas. And so I think of all the meta narratives within that, right? The stories of survival and resiliency and all that stuff, right? And stories of rebellion, right? And all that stuff. And it's, to me, it's a spark of the imagination, because to me that's the role I think history plays in my life, is that given my position, right, as a person who is a descendant of folks who were enslaved and whose history was purposely wiped out, and whose connection to their historical roots and their geographical historical roots were systematically erased, that the other side of that, the silver lining side of that, if you will, is that I get to imagine, right, all these different ways that my ancestors fought back and survived, right, all the things that brought me here, right, and to imagine and tap into all the potential different areas of strength and inspiration, right, to kind of get at your idea of how identities within the continent of Africa were constructed, in pre-colonial times, right? It's kind of like going back to that almost, but in the sense of like, getting to now, I guess, make some kind of like own hybrid identity, right? And really just delving into like what all that means, right, and how that shows up, right? And that's within myself, right? And I think the other part of history, right, is the relationship to others, right, that are around us or that we come into contact with, right? And I think part of the what could I say, tension. Right, tension around American history, so-called American history, right, is this kind of romanticized idea of how this nation evolved, set against juxtaposed, with the experiences of folks who were there but whose stories weren't told, right, or were only told in a certain way, and so that's a source of a lot of the tension, right, when it's, my story and your story, and they're so very different, right? And that we, arrived at, this place, for example, UC Santa Cruz, we arrived at this place through very, very different narratives, right? And so those narratives are going to have a very, very different, or going to inform us in very different ways, right? In how we navigate this space of higher education, for example, right? And so that, I think, is kind of the role that history plays, right? Is that we bring that history with us, whether we know it or not, right? This concept of what's it called? Intergenerational memory. Yeah. That we kind of bring that with us, right? And so it's not just our families and our home community that we bring with us, but it's also then this intergenerational thing on a subconscious level that we bring in any space with us. And so, that for me is why it's important to know, all different parts of a story, right? Not just the one that is bought and sold on a majority level. But again, engaging in the meta narratives, right? Like, what's the story within the story, and who are the different players that didn't get or don't get as much, highlight or recognition for their contribution. You are listening to Tackling the Taboo, a journey into history, part 1. This is DJ Dupsie, and under my voice is Didn't You Know by Erykah Badu, off the album Mama's Gun. Let's get back into the discussion with DJ StyloMac about how we engage in Black history on a personal, societal, and geographical level.
definitely touching on that, on two things, like that different narrative thing that where we came here for different reasons, but we ended up here in the same place. That definitely speaks back to that what I mentioned, like the geographical knowledge, like the ways in which we also need to come to understand when we're looking at different places, whether it's not just history, but you're like analyzing urban poverty, or you're just analyzing the different ways in which communities form. It's not a matter of just looking outside, trying to look inward and bring all this theory. Like theory is great and all that, but it's also a matter of, going into these communities, especially if you yourself identify within these communities, or you have the same identity. Like as a black male, you can go into a black community and just sort of ethnographic in a sense, basically, or it is ethnographic, where you're just a deep hanging out with folks in these communities, immersing yourself in these communities. So it's not you're just talking about folks, but you yourself are folks, if that makes sense. That you're not doing this work like many white scholars would do, we're going to look at a group of people, we're going to analyze them, but you're in there immersing yourself in the community to become that part of that community and empower that community. And in that you learn the different ways in which that community itself organizes, communicates, and interacts with, not just within itself, but with the greater outside landscape. And you pick up the different individual perceptions, but you pick up similar perceptions that kind of build that collective perception of what that community views it, right? Mm-hmm. So while we come with different narratives, we also, in our different interactions and our interactions with other folks, we come to find ourselves producing similar knowledge. An example, because I just came from here, but there's a strike going on right now from the AFSCME 3299 in terms of an unfair labor practice. And when we were down there, a lot of folks from different spaces, like the Worker Student Solidarity Coalition, BSU, Anakbayan, BSU being Black Student Union, we were all kind of asked to speak because ourselves, while we do come from different identity spaces such as Black Student Union, Anakbayan, a Filipinx identifying org, us and ourselves find ourselves interconnected by something. And that happened to be, at that moment and through different interactions, the Worker Student Solidarity Coalition and AFSCME 3299 Union, and what they're facing in the sense that we as students, especially students of color, while we come from the same communities as folks who are in AFSCME 3299, who make up our dining hall workers, our custodians, service workers, just different folks on campus who we take for granted. While we come from those same communities and have that similar geographical knowledge, we are now also about to move up in a class bracket upon getting this degree. So what's bringing us together is the fact that we continuously have to have that cross-class solidarity in what the geographical knowledge that we're getting from this institution is very different from the institutional knowledge. In the sense that, yes, we're reading and we're going to lectures, but it's also interactions with professors who understand these different struggles that produce more geographical knowledge, our interactions within ourselves as students in these different phases that produce that, and our understanding of the ways in which the university functions. And that's what brought us here, because when we heard it was an unfair labor strike, we understood right away without having to really ask, because we understand the ways in which this university outsources jobs that are union jobs to private entities, leading to these different union workers to not be able to get these jobs unless they're no longer part of the union, which is union busting. So we came to understand that from what we came to understand as individuals, but as well as different communities, and we came in together, if that again makes sense. And then going off of that, also going back to this intergenerational knowledge, I come to see it as very ancestral as well. Not just ancestry as in blood, but ancestry as in folks who were in the fight before I was. So I take it as to when we're talking about these issues, and we haven't said anything, but we feel that need to say something, or we just get that surge of what we call critical thought, or that surge of like, okay, no, well, I see it this way too, or like off that point, it's ancestors giving us also that kind of like that knowledge and that power to speak. It's them speaking through us, because I see it as ourselves we embody everything that we make up everything that the ancestors are and were, and they make up everything that we are and will be. Very, very abstract, but I come to believe this, in that every action, reaction, thought, form of expression, conversation, whatever have you, is them in some way, shape, or form. Our pain is their pain, our love is their love, their fight is our fight, and their liberation is our liberation. So these different ways in which we are, especially as students of color and as people of color, we are a continuous fight of this. And this, again, all goes back to history, how we come to understand it, and how we need to come to understand it outside of this Eurocentric construct of pastness and past, because past, present, future as well falls along very narrow constructions of eras, ancient, or antiquity, medieval, modern. Yeah,
it's all relative.
Yeah, all these relative things, we need to come to understand it as more rough and rugged, not so narrow, but also very fluid, in that how the past does not exist independent from the present. How we come to understand those who came before us is how we come to understand ourselves, and how we will come to understand that. A more abstract way of thinking of it, I don't know if I'm going to be reaching, but the ways in which you look at Afrofuturistic musicians like Sun Ra, Parliament, Funkadelic, or even now Janelle Monáe, specifically also Sun Ra, known to be one of the most famous Afrofuturistic jazz artists, how he, in Spaces of Place, especially his album, how he kind of, in the cover art as well, how he kind of conceived Egyptian history, or black history, because the Egyptians were black, or how we would now come to identify them as being black, how they understood themselves was, again, very different from how we identify them now. But the different ways in which culture at that time, he applied it not just to contemporary black culture, but futuristic black culture. So he came to understand that as affecting the present, and the present affecting that, in the ways in which we came to interpret it, and how also they came to interpret their contemporary time, right? So what was present for them back in ancient Egypt is past for us, and what is present for us was future for them, if that makes sense. Very abstract. And going back to that intergenerational knowledge, the ways in which Sun Ra came to be able to conceive this Afrofuturistic way of conceiving the future in a very Afrocentric way came from, the ancestors in some way, shape, or form, providing him with that, and not just getting caught up in the now, in the struggle, which was in the 1960s, in the civil rights and post-civil rights era, with black radical thought emerging as well. It wasn't just getting caught up in this struggle and abolishing these systems and fighting against these systems for liberation, but also trying to think of what this liberation is going to look like, embracing and loving blackness in the absence of these racializations, in the absence of Eurocentrism. And it's looked like going back to what we believe to be roots, what we conceive as being roots. How I would apply it now is we need to understand that we come from very different, our ancestry comes from very different, not just communities but regions, but they come from now countries that were not even created by the indigeneity of Africa, but by these European colonizers. But they come from, again, Igbo, Yoruba, Nzade, Asante, these different nations and communities. So it's a matter of not just going back to a specific community or specific nation, but going back to this array of diverse and very fluid culture and embracing it, and also not choosing what to embrace. Because when we look at how they were organized and came to understand things, was very, very different from how we choose to understand things, which is, again, very Eurocentric, and if not, also very heteropatriarchal or heteronormative, which is basically us being conditioned into believing that there's only two genders, there's only two sexualities, that men can be attracted.
Two sexualities, and one is bad. So it's not even that there's two sexualities. It's one that everyone is expected to be, and then there's, quote, the other.
Yeah. So like that. And then when we look at this and we look at how that has extended to today in different Caribbean communities, different Latin American communities as well, and then present day African communities, as we now come to understand it, we can see that they were very fluid, and that sexuality and eroticism was not looked down upon. It was very open, it was embraced, and it was very fluid, in that it wasn't something that didn't have anything to do with just power or because I'm attracted to only this specific, but it was about getting sort of something, some sort of connection, right?
Thank you for listening to Tackling the Taboo, A Journey into History Part 1. Once again, I am DJ Dupsie. Under my voice, you hear Sun Ra and his orchestra playing Languidity off of the so-named album. I hope you have enjoyed Part 1 of our journey into history. Part 2 follows right after this. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can reach out to tacklingthetaboo53@gmail.com. That's TACKLINGTHETABOO53@gmail.com. Until next time, stay black and lovely.